Welcome to the first Washington History Seminar in the COVID-19 era. Delighted to have so many viewers out there, more than 2,000 registered for this event. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center, and I co-chair this seminar in historical perspectives on national and international affairs, together with my colleague, Professor Eric Arneson from George Washington University. Eric will moderate today's discussion. Let me just make a couple of preliminary remarks. We usually, as many of you know, meet in person at this time of the week, but we were forced to postpone much of our spring 2020 program due to the pandemic. We're now starting up the seminar again online as a webinar and hope that, much as we miss the in-person encounter, this is an opportunity to expand the Washington History Seminar to new and even more diverse set of speakers, topics, formats, and of course, audiences. Before I turn the mic over to Eric, who will introduce today's speaker, Heather Cox Richardson, let me thank our sponsors, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest at Villanova University, the GW History Department, the National History Center, an initiative of the American Historical Association, and the Wilson Center, and many of you in the audience. We run this series on a shoestring budget, so we welcome your contributions, your financial contributions in support of the seminar. You can find instructions on how to donate to our organizations on the website of our two organizations. We also like to thank Rachel Wheatley at the National History Center and Peter Bierstecker on my team at the Wilson Center for the organization of today's event and the technical magic that goes into making it possible. Next week, July 20th, we will talk about a new book by Professor Lawrence Luthi, Cold Wars, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, with comments by Hope Harrison, Pierre Asselin, and Timothy Naftali. With that, let me turn it over to Eric. Eric.
Thank you, Christian. It's my pleasure to introduce Heather Cox Richardson, who is a professor of history at Boston College and the author of numerous books on American history and politics. Among those books are West from Appomattox, The Reconstruction of America After the Civil War, published by Yale University Press in 2007, Wounded Knee, Party Politics and the Road to an American Massacre, Basic Books 2010, To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party, Basic 2014, and most recently, and the subject of today's seminar, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America, published by Oxford University Press. I should also note that Heather Richardson writes widely for popular publications and is the author of a daily newsletter about the history behind today's headlines, Letters from an American. And I will turn over the screen to Heather, who will talk about the new book for a bit, and then we will open this up into a broader discussion of its book's many themes. With that, Heather, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for having me. And I just want to say something here about Eric and why, when he said, would you be willing to do this? I said, of course, I'll drop anything to do anything for Eric, because among other things, not only was he my partner in crime when I wrote my first book in the basement of Widener Library at Harvard University under the microfilm machines, but also he's the guy who started all this popular culture stuff when he asked me to write for a children's magazine many years ago now, Eric. Yeah, you're rolling your eyes, but this is all your fault. This is all your fault, because I discovered that I actually really liked writing for audiences other than the academies. So, so anyway, thank you very much for having me, and also for being such a great role model, Eric.
Thank you.
So this book, let me walk you really quickly through what this book does on the surface. But then, because this is an academic audience for the most part, or maybe an audience that's already heard me talk a lot about the book already, I'd like to talk about the themes behind it and the theory behind it, because it is, as I have said before, probably my smartest book. And I tried not to show that so when I wrote it. So the argument behind the book is that in the process of creating the concept of American democracy, the founders balanced American democracy on the idea idea that people of color and women could not be equal. And that inequality, I argued, equality depended on that inequality. Now, that's not original to me. That's an argument that came out of a book called American Slavery, American Freedom by Edmund Morgan in 1970, wasn't it, Eric?
Somewhere around then.
Yeah, I think it was 70.
Classic.
It might have been 72. Anyway, off the top of my head, I think it was 1970. And in that, he looked at the fact that the founders owned slaves. So how do you come up with the idea that all men are created equal when, in fact, you are enslaving other human beings? And so I took that idea and expanded it into the argument that that it was not just the idea of African American slavery that determined equality, but also the idea that simply there was a hierarchy in society and a few white men were on the top of it and everybody else was not. So the overall argument of the book is that the fact that equality depends on inequality has skewed our history. And what it did was, before the Civil War, it made American democracy take two paths. One down the line that Southern leaders took, which was the idea that in fact society worked best when a few men ruled everybody else. And this is really clearly articulated in the Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, explaining why the Confederate States had to construct their own constitution. But that got stood against, if you will, by Abraham Lincoln articulating for the new Republican Party a new vision of American democracy, or rather perhaps reclaiming the old ones, saying that in fact American democracy meant that every individual, and of course he's only talking about men, but that's going to be expanded in the mid 1860s to include women as well, should have equality of opportunity and equal access to and be equal before the laws. So theoretically, that would be a lovely place to end the book, and that's where actually a friend said, and maybe it was even you, Eric, said, do you think that the American history would have played out the way it did if there had not been a West, if in fact we would not be where we are today? And I thought about it and said, no, everything happens in the West. Because right in that moment when it seems like equality is going to triumph in the East, Euro-Americans move west across the Mississippi, as well as African Americans, by the way. And in that Western land, they recreated the ideology of the Confederacy that a few white men should dominate people of color and women. And they do so largely because of the Indian Wars, but also because of the history of Mexican society in those lands, and because of the influx of Chinese into California for the gold rush in the 1840s. So what I argued was that movement of Eastern Americans to the West gave a fertile ground for that ideology of the Confederacy, and that really took over American mythology with the cowboy. But that really becomes a political issue after 1880, when the Solid South makes it clear that the Republicans are going to have to attract new voters in the West, or they're never again going to dominate political American politics, because the South, with its steady adherence to the Democratic Party, is going to control everything. So then I took a look at how the West and the South become a political bloc and begin to push back against the East, not only in issues of finance, which other historians had identified before, but also with issues of race and economic development. And it was my contention in that book that one of the ways we got the progressive era was because, once again, the people in the West and the South had managed to reinstate the concept of subordination for non-white peoples and for women, in order to then be able to say that they could move, they could use the government to promote equality of opportunity for white men. And then the book goes on to look at how that Western argument is challenged first by the Depression, World War II, and a newly inclusive society looks like it's on the horizon, and how that once again, or not once again, how that gets overridden by the Western image and by the rise of movement conservatism in the 20th century. So that's the argument on its surface. And I'm sure Eric's going to have a lot to talk about with that. But I'd also like to throw out what I was really trying to do with this book. And that is that when I finished the last book on the Republican Party, I actually had a real crisis writing that book, because my books had always been about sort of how there's this zeitgeist of politics, if you will. People think a certain thing and then things change. And it's very hard to measure how ideology changes politics and therefore changes society. And at one point writing the last book, there was a chapter, and it got cut down, and so it no longer was a chapter, but the first version of that book was 1,000 pages long. So there was an entire chapter on what was essentially a dinner party. And I'm exaggerating a little, but not by much. Ulysses S. Grant comes into a dinner party that is that Charles Sumner is holding with 3 reporters, and nobody agrees on what happened, but basically the whole world falls apart. And I wrote that chapter and I thought, well, you know, either this is wrong or the other books are wrong, because how could these 4 guys matter as much as they did in really momentous things? That kind of throws the whole zeitgeist thing out the window. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between voters and leaders. And after I finished that book, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Long walks, lots of talks with people who are philosophers, both of language and of politics, lots of talks with politicians, trying to figure out the relationship between what voters do and what leaders do. And where I came out was the idea that, and it's a little bit more complicated than I will go into here, but that leaders change according to the language that is around them. They can both direct change through language, and they reflect the changes in language. So ultimately what this book was designed to do for academics, although I understand that many people haven't picked this up, and I do in fact put this in the introduction, was to argue for a new way to look at politics through language. And my basis for the argument that I made in it was that that in America, I won't do any other country, in America, this inequality being lashed to equality in our history has given oligarchs a language to undermine democracy by through a 4-step process. You know, what you do, and my steps began largely from my readings of Eric Hoffer, a philosopher of both totalitarianism, but also of language, who wrote a really terrific book in 1951 called True Believers. But also in a number of studies of psychology. I spent a long time looking at the history of language and the history of psychology. And what I came to believe was that in America, what happened before the Civil War and again after World War II, and to some degree in the 1890s, was that wealthy men managed to destabilize society, and in the process went through 4 stages that enabled them to challenge American democracy. And they did so like this. First of all, they destabilized society. Then they began to construct through language both a picture of an other and a justification for their own ascendancy over that other. Then they stoked fear and anger. And then when their policies increasingly hurt the voters that they needed to have on their team, they isolated those voters by controlling the media. And this happens really dramatically in the 1850s, and then of course in the late 20th century. And then finally they suppressed the vote. Or they jockeyed the vote in such a way that they managed to stay in power. And that what I argued was in the 1850s, and again in the present, we're looking at a moment where those oligarchs have managed to undermine democracy. And so it was an attempt to try and impose a new philosophy of political history that tried to tie together both regular people, ordinary voters, and leaders, and that had within it an organized structure for how that attempt in America being tied to our history has undermined democracy. And of course, the larger project is to say that our Americans' inability to grapple with inequality for people of color and for women not only hurts those categories of people, but constantly threatens to undermine our democracy. And the book ends with me saying, you know, let's get our acts together and figure this out, because otherwise we're going to lose democracy. So there you go. There's a wrap up. Your turn, Eric.
Thanks, Heather. There's a lot more in this book, and I'd like you to take an opportunity to walk us through a few of those steps. The first part of the book, and you've invoked Edmund Morgan, American Slavery and American Freedom, sets up the juxtaposition between a espousal of a belief in freedom and or democracy and the requirement that it rest upon inequality. If you could first just sort of summarize in a little bit more detail that early America story, and then shift us to the antebellum period, where the slaveholders, who play such an important role in this book, setting the stage for everything that's to follow, how they proceeded to do what you've just described, undermine democracy through the use of, amongst other things, language.
Sure, but again, let's do a nod here to Edmund Morgan, whose book really opened up my eyes all those years ago. And it's so funny, so many people say about that book, you know, he's dead wrong on this, and this. And I'm always like, yes, but he asked such a great question. You know, how do the same people who talk about, you know, every man is created equal, enslave other human beings? I mean, how do you even get there? And his argument, of course, was that the one grew from the other, that by enslaving the members of the body politic whom they considered to be unable to exercise responsible self-determination, they're able to conceive ideologically of freedom for everybody else. And if anybody's interested, it's a really interesting book. And I think probably I've made it more larger than life in my mind. I was a little surprised when I read it that some of the stuff I loved best was like footnotes, but he talks about how in the English settlers' vision, poor people were locked into their condition for life. There was no idea that people could actually rise from that. It was a lifetime condition, and those people were marked in their clothing and in their social status and in their culture. And the idea was simply that they could never really be redeemed, but what you could do was lock them away in poorhouses and at least try and get them to support themselves. So he transports that idea to the Tidewater region of Virginia and the Chesapeake, and says that, in fact, the same founders who were able to come up with the idea that every man is created equal had imported that ideology and placed it on their enslaved populations. Now, he doesn't go a lot into the history of enslavement, but the idea that you can say every man is created equal by removing all those people from the body politic, then you can do the radical thing of looking around you and saying, look at all these white men, you know, the poor guys, the guys on the make, whatever, they are all created equal. And that's, I think it's just such an interesting and to me somewhat convincing positions, simply because, I mean, among other things, I believe in this rhetorical construction of an other. But then from that, one of the things I found most interesting was following through the early years of the construction of the idea. Once you get to that idea that African Americans, especially in this case, although of course one of the things Morgan doesn't identify and later historians have, Virginians thought the same way about indigenous peoples, not only African Americans, and certainly about women. I mean, women just don't even make the cut, right? But one of the things that I found really interesting is once you are looking at this material with this lens, to look at the construction of the idea of the Southern planter. And that is really done so dramatically in John Pendleton Kennedy's Swallow Barn, which is one of the first American novels. It's not even written as a novel, it's written as a series of episodes in which there is really a deliberate construction of the idea that these white planters are better than the people around them, and they should be where they are, and they are exercising power because they're the ones who should be doing it. And that to me was really interesting, because it seems that to me, that when you get an extractive economy like cotton, or in the West like mining or cattle, or in the North like industrialization, you increase, or in the present with our growing conglomerate, our growing really wealthy corporate individuals, you get people who believe they belong there, not because they've been lucky or because they inherited money or because it just was the luck of the draw, but because they're really better than everybody else. And that was one of the things that's really interesting, to see the links between that early language in a novel like Swallow Barn and Peter Thiel writing today in magazines, or people like Jared Kushner talking, or Donald Trump talking about he only knows the best people. So then from that construction of the idea that we're better than everybody else, and by this group of people, I really identified the planters who owned more than 25 to 50 individuals because they exercised so much more power than the many white Southerners who enslaved one or two people and worked alongside them in the fields. And that was also very interesting because there's a number of terrific novels from the period and a couple of very good studies that take a look at that poor white Southern class and how much they resented the rich people. And we tend to think of the white Southerners as being their own group now, and they really weren't at all. And then, by then you're into the 1840s, and with the Trail of Tears and the opening up of the southeastern lands in America, again, Andrew Jackson really pushed that with the idea it was going to help the little guy, and it didn't. Those lands we know now overwhelmingly went to very wealthy men who managed to start a land rush and a slave boom, making enslaved people very, very expensive and shutting poorer white men out of the market, to the point that, a recent book by Carrie Lee Merritt suggests that, in fact, there was such a roving band of unemployed, landless white people before the Civil War that, in fact, the planters had to launch a civil war to combat the potential for revolution. So then you have them, and then following that through, the fact that increasingly white leaders in the South believe they should run everything. Increasingly, they refuse to entertain any idea of ending enslavement or of trying to diversify their economy. And finally, as they shut down more and more of the literature coming into the South, they take over the American government, and they do so very deliberately in a series of steps beginning in the early 1850s and going throughout that decade, until they have convinced themselves that they must control America or everything's going to be destroyed. And that those stages looked pretty clear to me, and they looked like they had a lot to do with the present.
Okay, so one of the things that you show in the book is that these slaveholders, in the aftermath of the Civil War, come to argue that the process of Reconstruction represents an illegitimate and harmful redistribution of wealth from those who deserve to those who do not deserve. And state interference before the Civil War and after the Civil War is highly problematic. And this is a theme that continues to resonate and that gets picked up later in time by movement conservatives. So in the book, you very eloquently and passionately connect the politics of the antebellum era to those that follow, taking the story up to the present. I want to kind of look at movement conservatism that crystallized in the 1950s and that triumphed in the 1980s, and how that connects to the anti-democratic or pro-oligarchic vision of Southern slaveholders. Now, the modern right has no shortage of historians these days, yet not all of them reach back to the pre-Civil War era to frame their accounts. We've got books by Angus Bergen, Kimberly Phillips Fine, and Lawrence Glickman, Jennifer Burns, Nicole Hemmer, Elizabeth Shermer. All of these anchor modern conservatism in a slightly different history and located with different individuals and institutions. So their accounts of the free market economics and the anti-New Deal, anti-Keynesian thinkers and activists sometimes have European roots, sometimes American, but slavery and slaveholders are generally not essential to their explanations. So are they wrong in ignoring that connection? And is it possible, in your view, to advance the free market ideology in a manner that does not support or require support for oligopoly or draw upon that larger pre-Civil War slaveholding vision?
Okay, so ask me the second half in a second because I'm not going to remember it.
Okay.
And yes, I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you cannot understand the modern day roots of movement conservatism without understanding Reconstruction. And you can't do that without understanding the large slaveholders before the Civil War, for the very simple reason that the language is identical. I mean, either you have to say that that it's coincidence that people are making the exact same argument in those two periods, or you have to see the connection between the two. And fortunately for my argument, the connection between the two is really clear in the historical records. So what Eric and I are talking about, and again, I'm going to throw something personal in here. Eric edited this book that I wrote about this in many years ago. Eric, do you remember Death of Reconstruction right before you went off on, yeah.
Yes.
This is where I really looked into the language you're talking about, and the fact that my perception of Reconstruction was formed by reading the New York Times from 1865 to about 1905. And because I didn't understand it, I didn't understand Reconstruction, and I found it enormously confusing. And when that happens, my go-to is to go to the sources. And that sounds really impressive, but the New York Times is only 4 pages long at this time, and 2 of those pages are advertisements. So this was not a huge time commitment. But what I found was that it was not the history that I had ever read before, because while we had always focused in my studies on race, what I felt that I saw when I looked at the New York Times, and of course from that I used the Times Index to read through the newspapers really widely, what I found was that racism was a constant. I mean, there was no period really where even the good guys, if you will, were not operating from a position of racial bias. So to me, that didn't explain historical change. So what I wanted to know was what caused historical change. And what it looked like to me caused historical change was a change in the language about the redistribution of tax dollars. And that said to me that the imposition of the Republican Party of taxes on our first national system of taxation on Americans during the Civil War was crucial to understanding the language by which, not mind you, the necessarily what was at stake. Clearly, race is vitally important. But the way that the Southern leaders managed to undermine American attempts to impose racial equality on the South after the Civil War is not on racial grounds. When they try to do that, Grant puts down the KKK and establishes the Department of Justice to make sure that doesn't happen anymore. What does the trick is to start to say, oh, we don't mind that these new voters are Black, which is ridiculous. Of course they mind the new voters are Black. But what they say is we mind that they are people without money who are refusing to work, and they are voting for politicians who promise them stuff in exchange for their votes. And the only way that stuff can be paid for is through tax dollars. And that's quite literally a redistribution of wealth. So in 1871, you see the New York Times, for example, but many newspapers beginning to use the words socialism and communism again and again and again. And that language, of course, goes throughout the late 19th century, and this is where we get the idea that there are certain people, immigrants are included in this pretty quickly, who shouldn't participate in American society, not yet on racial grounds. That language is really going to come to the fore after 1890, but on the grounds that they are not property holders. And literally, that's what people say. You know, should non-property holders have a say over taxpayers' money? And the answer that rising Northerners as well as recalcitrant Southerners comes to is no, they shouldn't. So that language is incredibly important, and it's really interesting that it comes up again especially in 1955, right after the passage of Brown versus Board of Education. And it comes up in 55 with the establishment of National Review. And National Review is established by William F. Buckley Jr., who in 1951 has written a book called God and Man at Yale, in which he is trying to convince people to turn against the New Deal and to turn against the programs that have stabilized society after the Depression, you know, provided a basic social safety net and regulated business and promoted infrastructure, and which are enormously popular, not only among Democrats, but also among Republicans. And this is what the program on which Dwight Eisenhower gets elected and pushes in 1952. And he tries to turn people against this New Deal government, what's known as a liberal consensus, and he really doesn't get any traction at all until the Supreme Court unanimously decides Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And of course, that's a decision led by the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, who has been a Republican governor of California. And with that in 55, with the establishment of National Review, Buckley hires a guy named James Kilpatrick, who is a Virginia newspaper editor, who deliberately links the idea of Black rights to the idea of an activist government and to communism. And of course, that's got enormous potential to turn crowds in that Cold War period. And that then from then on, you could almost superimpose the language of Reconstruction on that period, right up really until the present.
So let me get to the second part of the question, but preface it by saying in your book, you cite Buckley a number of times, and at one point you quote him as saying, government must be limited solely to the protecting of life, liberty, and property. His worldview, you continue, quote, was based on an ideology that looked very much like that of James Henry Hammond and his fellow slaveholders a century before. The resemblance is clear, but my second question is it possible for conservatives to advance free market ideology in a manner that does not require support for oligarchy or that doesn't tar them with this long historical brush of slavery's shadow?
Oh, for sure. Yes. And that's one of the things that, I mean, let me be careful about that, because of course the words free market ideas are fraught nowadays. Does that mean a defense of capitalism, or does that mean a defense of full-throated libertarianism at this point? And I think the answer, let me break that down a little bit. I think the answer to the latter is no. I think libertarianism in America deliberately says, a few guys are going to get everything. And that's not because of, that's not random. I mean, it's the idea that if in fact everything is a free-for-all, you're going to end up with a few people monopolizing stuff. And as you know, in, I don't know, some book, I talked about how this is exactly what happened in Kentucky. Right after the Constitution was signed, when there's a land rush into Kentucky and everybody thinks, oh, this is just ducky, everybody's going to have a free shot. And they discover pretty quickly that a few rich guys control everything. And that's why Abraham Lincoln's family runs into such trouble there. So I think if you go full out libertarianism, then you have a real problem, because inherently it does privilege white men of property. But I think it's certainly possible to support capitalism and the idea of a free market, or regulated free market, if you will, and not at all, and to believe that equality can exist within that. And I think you saw attempts to reach that to some degree. Now, there's also limits to that with Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who both came from extraordinarily different positions, but in both cases wanted to believe that you could, in fact, have an American capitalism that did, in fact, permit equality. Now, they were limited, and they, for various reasons, both because of their own vision and because of their own political possibilities, but the two are certainly not incompatible.
Let me shift now to the portion of the book that deals with the West. About a quarter of the way into the book, you write that the triumph of equality was an illusion. The oligarchic principles of the Confederacy did not die. Timing and geography would give them a new lease on life, unquote. And so your narrative then veers westward at this point. But I still keep wondering about the North itself, both before and after the Civil War. Equality before the law may have become established with Reconstruction, but that hardly convinced all Northerners, white Northerners, to believe or espouse equality. The racial animus that was on display was not just among Northern Democrats, but many Midwestern Republican as well. This did not fade away. The war doesn't wipe out those beliefs. So you can argue that the West provided fertile soil for many Southern values, the ones that you highlight. But I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about where the North fits into this. Discrimination against African Americans in the North, particularly in the labor market, remained deeply entrenched and remained legal. And later, with new waves of Southern and Eastern European immigrants, there are new racialized anti-immigrant discourses that flourish. So are these sins that are largely the property of the white South and then Westerners? And if so, doesn't this let off the hook many other white Americans from the North?
So I love this, because I told people that you were not going to pull any punches. So, and this is one of the reasons I've always loved arguing with you, Eric, is because no, there has been criticism of the book that it makes the North sound like a paradise. And I think that is just a reflection of a piece of it that was not as well written as it should have been. Because there are two things going on here. One is that I wanted to make the point that extractive economies deliberately create, just because of their nature, create sort of poles around which societies spin. And within those poles, for an extractive economy, because they are so heavily capitalized, they tend to have really rich people at the top, a few of them, and a lot of really poor people working for them. And those rich people at the top end up having a lot of political power, a lot of political clout, and they also happen to create dynasties, which is something that I didn't really get into as much as I would have liked to in the book. But certainly some of the dynasties that are established in the West continue really right up until the present. So I at first was making the point about extractive economies of the South and of the West versus the originally more subsistence economy of the North. But with the rise of industries in the North, you certainly have that same kind of idea. That being said, the larger point that I was trying to make with I think you're thinking primarily of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, is that with the ascendancy of the West and the South together as a political force, and the recognition on the part of the Republicans that they have to court that force, first of all, in 1882, the Republican Party shifts away from the idea of equality of opportunity and equality before the law, and writes into American law for the first time the kind of racial hierarchy that people like Abraham Lincoln had found abhorrent, and that, of course, is the Chinese Restriction Act, or the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that idea that some people are better than others becomes the law of the land. Not only through the Chinese Exclusion Act, but also through the insular cases at the turn of the century, where we literally put into our fundamental law a decision in a number of decisions by the Supreme Court that we have dependents who are not equal to everybody else in American society. They are non-citizen nationals, for example, and that we have lands that are not technically colonial, but they are also not really part of America either. And that's, of course, the Philippines at the time, although that status changes in 1943, but also Samoa and Puerto Rico and the islands that America acquires in that period. So we actually have written in the end of the late 19th century into our law that kind of hierarchy that the Confederate leaders had reached for, and with that concept of some people are better than others, not only, and I'm not talking only by the end of the 19th century, but earlier than that, as that idea rises and as it becomes acceptable in the North among Northern Republican leaders, it absolutely bleeds into Northern language, but also into Northern actions. And you can see, yes, obviously the rise of racial attacks in this period, but also the really largely the undermining of steps that had been made toward racial equality in the period after the Civil War. Interestingly enough, not entirely though. There is still in the North move toward, especially in northern cities, a move toward an attempt to create some sort of racial equality. And I hate to do this to you, but I have to mention Grover Cleveland, because Grover Cleveland did in fact run on a platform of racial equality. Now it's one that didn't obtain and that ended up not taking hold the way one would have hoped it would have. But of course he, during his tenure in New York, was responsible for desegregating the New York City police force and did try to take that national. And when he's elected or inaugurated in 1885, a lot of people thought in the North that he was going to fix things. And that's a lot later than most people realize.
You mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I want to kind of put this into sort of the larger context of the book and ask you to expand on some things. So you highlight oligarchic values and the oligarchs who held those values. And I think one can argue that there's something of a top-down quality to the account of politics in the book that emphasizes the beliefs and actions of those on top. But as you, in this book and elsewhere, and many other historians have shown, American racism was hardly a top-down imposition. Middle class and working class whites in the 19th century, for instance, were often strongly anti-Black and required no encouragement from their social betters to oppose Black advancement. And the anti-Chinese sentiment in the West that resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act had large numbers of enthusiastic white workers who both demanded legislative action on this front and directed and participated in violence against the Chinese in their workplaces and in their communities. And you've also shown in the book how white settlers who are no fans of Native Americans, attacked them and demonized them as they continued their westward push. So I'm hoping that you could speak a little bit about how this bottom-up racial hostility fits into the larger picture that you paint.
I will, yes. And one of the things that's interesting about the Chinese Exclusion Act is that it's really pushed by Dennis Kearney in San Francisco. Yep. He's a fascinating character. And you remember when he started, so he's a what's called a drayman. He's a guy who has a cart or a number of carts actually, and he carries stuff in the carts. And he gets mad because the guys who run San Francisco won't fix the potholes in the road, and they're breaking his cartwheels, and he can't get them to do anything. So he tries to organize ordinary San Francisco people on the docks to go ahead and push back against the guys who run San Francisco. And when he starts out, he tries to include the Chinese in that movement. He wants to include them in that movement against the leaders. Within a very short amount of time, he discovers he gets more attention if he actually turns against the Chinese, and that's when he just develops the tagline, "The Chinese must go." But anyway, that speaks, what you're talking about, the relationship of people at the bottom, ordinary voters and leaders, is part of what I was talking about initially with the theory that I have about the way politics works. And that's that to me, the thread between voters and leaders is narrative. It's the stories people tell. So what happens is that if you have a leader who represents a number of voters, they probably are getting along just fine, like, no one pays that much attention to politics. And then things start to go badly for a certain number of people, but they can't get any traction. They start to grumble, they start to complain, nobody pays a great deal of attention. And finally, what happens is enough of them speak up that a new politician or an old politician who has had a falling out with his party begins to speak for those people by using their language, by picking up their language. And he manages, or she, at this period is he, manages to articulate for them what they couldn't articulate before. And around their disapproval of the current political system, either the leader or people from within that ordinary group of voters, the journalists, the book writers, the historians, manage to tell a narrative that will attract other people to their standard. And one of the points I was trying to make in the book is that you manage to organize those people most effectively if you are, to promote democracy, if you reclaim the language of values, of beneficial values. But if you're somebody who is an oligarch trying to take power, you organize those sorts of people most effectively by creating an other. And that's a place where the Chinese Exclusion Act is a place where creating an other made it possible for somebody like Dennis Kearney to win, and then to go ahead and have his cause picked up not only by the Democrats in California, but also by the National Republican Party.
Thank you. Let me shift gears for a moment. Your book is largely the story of domestic politics, of an American promise or paradox, and the way that it unfolds over the centuries. The story centers on economics, geography, and especially race. If you were to write a sequel to this book, where would foreign policy, particularly in the 20th and the 21st century, fit into that story?
Well, the foreign policy is, as you know, in my books so far, has been taken a bit of a backseat to domestic politics, because I'm primarily interested in the way that language about foreign policy impacts domestic politics. Because I guess, to me, at its heart, and I feel so sorry for the foreign policy people listening, American politics is essentially about America. And we see foreign countries through an American lens. So the place where there would be intersection for me is the way in which domestic politicians used issues, for example, the rise of communism in China, turned against, basically all the way back to World War I, used issues like the League of Nations to try and consolidate domestic power, used the build up to World War II to try and undermine FDR. To me, the injection of foreign policy is much more a way to reinforce the domestic pieces at home than it is to try and create, if you will, I hate to say that word, I won't say that word, try and create a new consensus in other countries. Now, the one exception to that, of course, for me is Eisenhower, because Eisenhower really did have a global vision, and a global vision that was a moral global vision. And he didn't necessarily put it in place very effectively, but his vision really was an attempt to create a new global, I'm not going to say that word, to create a new way to look at the globe as a whole. And so how would it be different if I added that in? It probably wouldn't be all that different, to be honest.
Okay. Let me get a little bit further into the 20th century. Movement conservatives, after their defeat with the election in 1964, stage a comeback. And by Reagan's election, they are riding high in the proverbial saddle. So my question is, how and why did the defenders of the old or older New Deal order fail so badly? Why did they prove so unsuccessful at offering a counter-narrative to retain their hold on political power, or to at least maintain some ideological relevance?
Okay, so
how did the Democrats blow it?
Okay, so here's what I would say. I would say the Democrats did a crappy job, and so did the Republicans. And here's why. Because I know you're looking at that. I don't consider the movement conservatives Republicans. I consider them a third party that came in and took over the Republicans. And the reason for that is this. You know, there was a study written in 1960 called The American Voter. And it argued that it's a really interesting study. So it's sort of a launching early political science. And what it said was that, it was by a guy named John Converse. And what it said was that, that Americans didn't really vote according to ideology any longer because everybody believed the same thing. So that the way that you had to win an election was to cobble together different coalitions. And this really was a huge deal in terms of thinking about the way Americans voted. It's like a classic text now. And the Republican Party grabbed hold of this pretty quickly under Nixon. After 64, when you had, it was pretty clear that Goldwater had managed to cross over from the Republican Party into the Dixiecrats and attach some of the Southern Democrats to the Republican Party. So in 64, Richard Nixon grabs hold of this idea. And as you know, he cobbles together, very deliberately cobbles together an election based on a number of different interest groups. And with that, after Nixon's election, with that we get the writing in 69 of the very famous book, The Emerging Republican Majority. The idea that in order to stay in power forever, basically what the Republicans needed to do was to pull together socially traditional people along with Southern Democrats and law and order people, and with that they would be able to dominate American society from there on. And that's what the Republicans did. The Republicans went ahead, traditional Republicans went ahead and tried to nail things together. And then shortly after that, the Democrats did as well. But the Democrats, if you will, get into a problem in the early 1970s. And I'll explain that in a second. But when the traditional Republicans sort of buy into this idea that they don't have to argue any longer for Eisenhower's middle way, for Nelson Rockefeller's vision of conservatism, that in fact what they really need to do is just simply nail together groups. From that, you get a void, I would argue, in America, where people are starved for a story about why their vote matters. Why does it matter that they're going to show up and vote? And the people who give that to them are the movement conservatives. They talk about how American democracy is under siege by essentially communism, and that it's crushing individualism, and that individuals have to go out and take back America from this behemoth government. And, I always point to the fact that it's 1977 that you get Star Wars, and the image of Luke Skywalker taking on the empire. And of course, Reagan really hits his stride in 78 and is elected in 1980, based with that incredibly powerful mythological narrative that harks not only back to Star Wars, but also back to the Bible and to, every little guy overcoming the big guy story you can think of. But the Democrats, meanwhile, dropped their narrative really altogether in the early 70s, not only by jumping on board the idea of coalitions, but by the rewriting of the rules of the Democratic National Convention and National Committee in 1972 that are going to give us McGovern, because they began themselves to focus less on a narrative than on coalitions. And if you remember the rewriting of that, of those rules in the party, they really do give a quota to who should speak and who should have a say in the platform. And that's a wonderful attempt at inclusion, but what it did do was it destroyed the ability of the party to come up with a narrative really in any meaningful way, except at various points, like Clinton's, it's the economy, stupid. And Barack Obama managed to do so to some degree as well. But interestingly enough, I don't know if you saw just a couple days ago, the Biden campaign began to issue its own new policy papers, and they have returned to a narrative. It's actually really interesting to see how they're trying to reclaim that from President Donald Trump now, who has his own sort of apocalyptic narrative. The Democrats seem to be adopting one on their own again now.
Okay, so let me...
You're putting me through my paces here, Eric.
Hey, that's my job, and that's what we do. So let me push you a little bit more on this. So you just made this point, and in the book you also argue that the Republican Party was taken over by movement conservatives and, quote, was no longer responsible to a majority of voters, let alone to a majority of Americans, unquote. I know that you are a close observer of American politics, and I'm sure that you've heard more than a few voices on Twitter, in newspapers, on cable programs, by those on the left who would apply the same punchline about non-accountability to the Democrats. The argument that the Democratic Party succumbed to deregulation and the gospel of neoliberalism, this was a argument that animated many of those who supported the candidacy of Senator Bernie Sanders. And in the historical literature, and among some occasionally historically minded pundits, the Democratic Party as a whole hasn't fared all that well. You note in the book that the New Deal incorporated racial disparities into its programs. Many historians have elaborated on this. You could move forward in time. The left might say that Truman may have begun the desegregation of the armed forces, as you note in the book, but he did so because he was forced to by social protest and electoral concerns. Besides, they still preferred Henry Wallace, the candidate of the left, to Truman. You note that Kennedy continued to expand equality of opportunity and used the government to promote Black equality. The left might say that Kennedy dragged his feet on civil rights and moved reluctantly, only when compelled to by activists who forced the issue onto the national agenda. Their treatment of Carter is hardly favorable. They blame Bill Clinton for mass incarceration and a punitive welfare state. Obama set the stage for the Tea Party by bailing out Wall Street and doing little for Main Street after the financial crisis. Oh, and he didn't close Guantanamo as promised. And in 2016 and 2020, the Democratic establishment blocked Sanders' victory. So the left, academic and political, isn't a fan of the Democratic Party either, and would argue, I imagine, that it too is not particularly representative of either voters or the country. Your book isn't about that, but I'm hoping that you might reflect on these broader criticisms as they pertain to the Democrats.
Yes, but you're mixing up two things there.
Okay.
One is the mechanics of politics, and one is the ideology and the narrative of politics.
Okay.
And those two things don't really belong together in this one, because when I'm talking about how the current Republican Party does not reflect a majority of voters, let alone a majority of Americans, I am reflecting on the mechanical destruction of equal access to the ballot. I mean, I'm talking about gerrymandering. I'm talking about suppression of the votes. And one of the things that Stacey Abrams has done so well is to point out the fact that when we talk about the red states in the South, we should really call them voter suppression states, because that's exactly what they are. And one of the things that I thought was the most interesting thing about researching that book was taking a look at how it's really the law in Florida right before the election of 2000 that disfranchises up to 100,000 people, that leads to the hanging Chad problem of the 2000 election and ends up giving us George W. Bush as president. And that, it's pretty clear that had that law not gone through, that voter suppression law not gone through, that those 327 votes that ended up being contested would simply not have been an issue. And that attempt to thwart the mechanics of our politics is different than saying that somebody doesn't represent the mindset of the people. Now to that point, you said that the Democratic Party didn't reflect in 2020, didn't reflect Sanders's power.
I meant the Democratic establishment. That's the charge. That was the charge.
I know it's the charge, but he didn't have the votes. I mean, this is one of the things where people get very frustrated with me because, as you know, I've been under fire repeatedly from both the left and the right, and that's because I'm in love with politics and with history. And the simple fact of the matter is, you got to have the votes, and Sanders did not have the votes. And that is an enormous frustration to a lot of people, but it is what it is, right? So there's a mechanical thing as well. Now, that being said, more interesting to me is the argument that the Democratic Party does not and has not represented the American people. And that really in the period of neoliberalism where it's gone, where it moved right. The Democratic Party did move right significantly, but that's because that's where the pressure was from. That's the way the American culture went. That's what movies did. That's what newspapers did. That's what the language sounded like. And if you spoke more as if you were a traditional leftist, you got erased, you got ignored. And it was interesting, I had a conversation with one of my graduate students about Sanders, huge Sanders supporter, and I'm so sorry everybody, but every time they would come in, I would say, he's 78. He's 78, find someone younger. He's 78, you don't belong in the presidency if you're 78 years old. And she finally said to me, who would you have us support? Because there's new young people that are really too young, and there's this whole group of people who got purged out of the party because when they stood up for more left positions in the 90s, in the aughts, they got dismissed and read out of American politics. So that's a question of, did the Democratic Party move right? Sure, but where were the voices forcing it to move back? I mean, I think right now Biden is a really interesting example because Biden is so famous for standing in the middle. He stands in the middle of the party. And that has forced him to move significantly left, even over the last few months. If that pressure is out there, leaders respond to it. But they, as you know, they respond to where the pressure is. And that pressure was not there in the 90s and the aughts and until very recently. Now, mind you, that might not entirely be the fault of the people who are trying to put pressure on them. Control of the media really matters. And if you're not being seen, even though you're protesting, it doesn't do you much good to protest.
Let me pose one last official question, and then we will open it up to our audience. You offer a conclusion that by 2016, the Republicans sounded, quote, eerily like antebellum slaveholders in defense of of a system in which wealthy elites rule over the masses, unquote. And so my question is, where does right-wing populism fit in, or how would you describe right-wing populism in this context? Trump ran in part against elites in both parties, and Republican support for voter suppression efforts are not generally justified by resorting to overt anti-democratic arguments, but by an insistence that voter fraud itself is undermining democracy. I know it's a matter of words, but this strikes me as a bit different than the slaveholders' arguments. Why am I wrong?
Well, I want to start by saying that it is important to remember that Donald Trump ran as an economic moderate. You know, people always forget that, but when they were originally, like, what were there, 604 people on that Republican stage in the early days of the campaign, he was the only one who was talking about tax reform, universal health care. He was talking as an economic moderate. Now, we know he didn't ever intend to do that, but that's a piece that a lot of people are forgetting now, that if you listen to him, I mean, I just remember listening to Carly Fiorini and being like, wow, even she's like way out there on as a Republican extremist, and Trump was not like that. So that's part of where the populism comes from. But I do think, and I maintain, that the reason that he is a symptom, he is not the cause of the malaise in the Republican Party right now, and that is because really since Reagan, the Republican Party has conceived of an other that is destroying American society and that ultimately must be kept from power at all costs. And this is precisely what we saw in the 1850s. And again in the 1890s, when that other was in fact purged from the American political base through disfranchisement, through lynching, through, all the suppression tactics that obtained from the 1890s to the 1930s. And that construction of the other is one that is enormously popular, not only, I mean, certainly on racial grounds, but also because, and this is the point that I was really trying to get at the book, and I'm not entirely sure I did it as well as I wanted to. You know, not only are as I said at one point, not only are the people who were voting for, I don't remember who it was, Andrew Jackson or whatever, vicious racists, they were also Democrats in the small d sense. They were both of those things together. And convincing people that to be a true American, a good American, you have to suppress these people who are destroying America, that's a lot of right-wing populism, I think.
Thank you. I've monopolized all of your time up to this point, but we have many hundreds of people who are listening, and I am seeing some hands raised. So we're going to open this up for questions from people in the audience. In order to ask a question, you have to click on that little icon of raising your hand. I then have to find it on my screen. I then have to call on you, and we have to unmute you. And so we're going to give this a try.
And then hopefully we're invading Europe.
Just follow the instructions. So first we have, I'm clicking on the hand of one Sonia Michelle. Are you there, Sonia?
I'm here.
Oh, very good.
Can you let your camera work if you've got one, Sonia?
I have a camera. I'm not sure how to do that.
It's in the lower left-hand corner. It should say start video.
We do see your name.
Yeah, you do see my name. I see audio. I don't see that. I'm not looking great anyway, so let me talk. This is fascinating. I mean, it's just amazing, your grasp of all of these broad movements, but also these subtleties. So, but we know that throughout history, or at least in the 20th century, the progressives have managed to break through at different times. During the Progressive era, during the New Deal, during the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Movement, and now Black Lives Matter. So I wonder how you fit those moments into your larger scheme. I mean, how does that happen? How does the oligarch lose its grip? Do they stop paying attention for a minute? What happened? The oligarchy, what happens? How does that happen?
So that's a really great question. And my take on it is that what happens is that as the policies that are being enacted by the people in charge increasingly create an underclass, and I don't just mean an economic underclass, I mean increasingly don't answer the needs of a growing number of people, more and more they start to talk to each other, and they start to say, hey, did you see this? I wasn't so keen on that. And gradually they start to find a common voice. And that common voice eventually is going to get people out protesting. And with luck, it's going to kick up people who can articulate what's at fault. And when they do that, that helps to create a movement. And this is one of the reasons that, at least I think so, and this is one of the reasons that I'm so into the idea of people talking and creating narratives and taking up oxygen. If you follow me, and I'm always saying take up oxygen, because that's how people find each other, and that's how they change the narrative, change the way people are talking about things. Now, the way that I came into this, thinking about it this way, is actually, I think, sort of an interesting story. I have a colleague named Joel Wolf, who's a Brazilianist from another university. And I got to, he was one of the people I constantly pestered with questions about politics, because he studies politics in Brazil. And I know nothing about Brazil. I could barely find it on a map. So he's a really good person for us, the two of us, to talk, because we have very different perspectives. And he actually found a series of letters from some Brazilian leader, and I have no idea who, in the 20th century. And he had in his files all these letters of people writing to him going, you suck because you did this, and I hate this, and I hate this. And one of the guys that worked for this leader, whoever he was, had a falling out with the leader and went off to become his own, politician in his own right. And literally he had taken these letters and he had circled the sections or squared in the sections that said, you suck because you did whatever. And he lifted those passages directly into his speeches to try and attract new voters. And that seemed to me to be, and then he'd marked them with his initials. So Joel could tell that was exactly what he had done. And that seemed to me to be a really interesting way to think about change. Sometimes it's leaders saying, you need to hate these people. And sometimes it's people at the bottom saying, we're not really happy. And somebody finally articulating that. And once they have articulated that, it's much easier for them to create a leader from their own midst, or to attract a leader who says, I'm going to capitalize on all these angry people and start to speak for them. At least that's what it looks like to me.
Thank you. I'm seeing a hand up from Chuck Jones. I think I've just activated you. Are you there? Chuck Jones. Hello? Oh, there you are. I see a picture. Are you unmuted?
That's probably it.
Can we unmute at our end? Okay. Let's try again. And in this case, let's go to Amanda Moore. Amanda, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Thank you. Good.
My question for the author is quite simple. When will her book be available in paperback?
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry, you're breaking up.
When will your book be available in paperback?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. It just came out in hard copy, so I have no idea. But I will let you know about that.
Please.
Good.
And enjoyed your presentation very much.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Good. We have Chris Woods. Chris, you are muted on my screen here. Can Rachel Wheatley up? Thank you.
You got me?
We've got you.
Chris, where are you from?
Waitsfield, Vermont.
Right next to Eric. All right.
I'm in East Wallingford.
There you go. So can you make a case for national strength versus weakness in terms of equality? It seems like all the inequality has coincided with economic weakness, not to mention the obviously incompetent response to the pandemic. Aren't we simply smarter, stronger, and more effective as an equal society?
So that's a great question. And one of the things that that Eric will probably want to weigh in on is one of the observations about our best times in American history and our most progressive times are that they are times of economic prosperity. That tends, economic downturns tend to divide society. And again, that's when you get the rise of oligarchic leaders, I think, who monopolize that moment to say it's their fault, not my fault. But that being said, you're talking exactly the way that FDR was during World War II. There's two ways to look at the world, he was arguing. One is democracy, which is messy and it's ugly and it makes mistakes and all that. But he talked a lot about Mussolini, and the image of Mussolini, who's the guy who but who really articulates the idea of fascism, the idea that really some people are better than others, so ultimately you need to have one leader who directs everybody else, and you tie people together with nationalism and with militarism and by turning them against another. Repeatedly, FDR would say, everybody talks about how fascism is supposed to be so strong. The idea of fasces is that it means strength. But look, those people are starving. It's the democratic governments that are able to go in there and feed the people. It's the democratic governments who are winning. And, it's a question of how you look at society. A lot of societies have believed over the centuries that the way you move a society forward is to have a few well-connected, wealthy guys run everything because they can make it much more efficient. But people like Abraham Lincoln said, no, that's crap, because those guys get lazy and corrupt. And mind you, Lincoln didn't say crap. I said that. And they end up not innovating. And in order to really make people innovate, you want to put the resources of the government, make them available at the bottom, and make education available to people at the bottom, because they innovate, because through democracy they'll make mistakes, but eventually they'll come out the right way. So I'm 100% on your team. I think that this is not only an ideological division, but also one that we in America have proven works. We work best when we work full-throated as a democracy, the way we did during World War II, for example, or during the Civil War. We don't do so well when we turn things over to a few people, the way we did in the 1890s and the 1920s and the 1850s and the present.
I am now calling on Mark Levinson, who is a Wilson Center regular and a presenter in the past about one of his books. Mark.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for a very interesting presentation here, and kind of a provocative one. My question is whether it isn't too narrow to examine the development of neoliberalism and the rightward shift simply in a domestic political context. And there were really objective reasons for that in the 1970s, right? In the early 1980s, the economy was doing lousy, and the political leaders didn't have much of a solution to that. And during that period, one saw very similar trends across all the wealthy economies. They all shifted to the right. They all felt that the social welfare model was lacking in some way, and that a shot of market something was needed to reinvigorate their economies. So I have count me as skeptical that this is simply a construct of the oligarchy defining the discussion.
I think it's fair to say that this is a wider conversation in terms of the rise of neoliberalism in the 20th century. But that, of course, wasn't what I set out to do. But that being said, there's a couple of questions there. First of all, I think you're right. I don't think you can look at the rise of neoliberalism without looking at what happened in other countries. And, there's a wonderful new book out by Amy Offner about how the people who were trying to implement social welfare programs, among other things, in Latin America ended up really sort of turning toward privatization and bringing that back into America, the United States of America proper. So there's a great example of how what happened overseas or in other countries was at least as important, if not more important, than what happened here. But that being said, there's the question, you said that there's a lot of sense of how things are really not working in the 1970s. Well, whose sense is that? mean, a lot of the question is who's at the table, and I wonder if things would have looked the way they did. And mind you, I'm not advocating any kind of an outcome, except the idea that things were so bad in the 1970s that they had to be changed. It begs the question of who decided who they got changed. I mean, who decided what the changes were going to be, what those changes should be. And of course, I'm always suspicious of the fact that Reagan so misrepresented Carter's presidency in America in the 1970s. If it was really so bad, why did he have to lie about it? You know, and we know quite clearly he takes a look at, for example, the argument that Reagan makes that that Carter has slashed the military budget. Well, that's simply not true. You know, and he hits that again and again and again and again and again. Reporters laugh at Reagan and say he's making crap up. And yet, obviously, he manages to create a narrative that people adhere to. So I don't think it's really fair to look at this entirely as an economic problem alone, because I think you have to look at who is declaring it an economic problem and who is providing the solutions to that economic program. My guess is if they were a more diverse population, they would not have found the solutions that we did come up with in the 1980s for a return to what is now called neoliberalism.
Thank you. So I'm now recognizing Sabine O'Donnell. Trying to do that. Is that working?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my question. Very interesting presentation. As a German-born, naturalized American, having lived here for 30 years, I've always been struck by the two-party system in American politics. Can you ever envision a time when there would be more than those two parties? You mentioned developing leadership in other movements. That's the end of my question. Thank you.
So if you had asked me that 3 years ago, I would say no. And the reason I would have said no was because of the mechanics of the parties themselves, which are deeply entrenched not only in the local and the state level and the national level as well, but are deeply entrenched in people's personal loyalties. You know, especially if you're from a rural area, you know, people who would vote for a rock if it had a D or an R after it, simply because their loyalties to their parties are loyalties to their families, their loyalties to their towns. And in addition to that, of course, you have the mechanics of the fact you have really institutional memory that makes it very hard to break for a new party to break in. Now, I said 3 years ago, that's what I would have said, and that is what I said 3 years ago. I'm really interested in ranked choice voting, which has been tried in Maine, and that's a system whereby people rank their choices, obviously, and there's a system of counting whereby if you don't get your first choice, it goes to your second choice if there isn't a natural winner after the first balloting. And what that has done is it's enabled people to vote on a first ballot for, or as their first choice for a third party candidate who doesn't really have a chance of winning. But that opens up the door for many more voices, because it's possible for people to get votes without needing to win the election, and to have a much larger voice in the discussion than they otherwise might have had. And that, I think, opens up the possibility for there being different coalitions. And Maine did it in its last election, and in a district that had a choice between one candidate and on the left and another candidate on the far right. Because ranked choice voting came into play, the guy who emerged was a fairly conservative Democrat. I think he is. To be honest, I'm not even sure which party he's in, and he's enormously popular, which is interesting because, of course, he did not win on the first ballot, but people have loved him because he was sort of straight down the middle. And that, to me, was a really interesting experiment. And one, by the way, that I opposed. I was not in favor of ranked choice voting until I saw how it played out in that particular election. I thought, man, this is something that really could be a game changer.
Thank you. I'm now calling on Danny Smart.
Danny, I get to see you. I don't know Danny, but I know her name. Danny, turn on your camera and tell me where you're from.
We can't turn the cameras on, but she can speak now that she's been unmuted. Danny?
There, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can't turn the camera on. Well, that's frustrating.
Sorry.
So I come from a mixed family, shall we say. I have a husband who's quite the Republican running for office, and myself a Democrat, and all of our adult kids are Democrats. And what we're kind of trying to come up with is a conversation within the family about how I think that the Republican Party has shot itself deeply, deeply in the foot. And I think that there's a group of people who would like to see it not necessarily go away and have a third party come in, but can you see a chance for the Republican Party to rebuild itself on a different level? I mean, that they can go back to its roots, or are we so far entrenched in the conservatives being the Republican Party that we can't go back there again?
So yes, one of the things that I've always said about American politics is that it's far easier to reform a party from within than it is to create a new party. And this is done very dramatically in the Republican Party at the turn of the century with Teddy Roosevelt and Fighting Bob La Follette and, Henry Cabot Lodge and Albert Beveridge. And what they did is, they refused to jump ship in 1884 when everybody else went over to the mugwumps because they couldn't stand James G. Blaine. And they stayed within the Republican Party and they completely rebuilt it because they said it's no longer our party the way it is now, with it basically being in the pocket of big business. But what I would say about the modern day Republican Party is, first of all, yes, it has shot itself in the foot because right now it's associated with Donald Trump. And I'm not even sure it is the Republican Party anymore. I think it's the Trump Party. But if in fact you were trying to rebuild the traditional Republican Party, here's what I would do. And I've always said I would love to be the speechwriter for this just because of the ideological twists that I know so well from studying the Republican Party. The Republican Party is different than the Democratic Party in that the Republican Party forms in the 1850s with a different ideology about the way America works. And what Republicans argue under Abraham Lincoln is that it is that America is a social web, that you need to put resources at the bottom because people will be able to produce more than they consume, and that will support the middle class, and the middle class then will in turn support a few financiers and industrialists, and those people will in turn hire people at the bottom. So they see society as a social web, and that's very different than the Democrats, who tend to see, I always think of it as a line, see the haves and the have-nots. So I always think of them sort of as a line and a circle, and that Republican ideology is baked into American DNA the same way that the Democratic ideology is. And they're not yin and yang. They are really different, and sometimes they're absolutely opposed, but most of the time they overlap in some way or another. And I keep maintaining that if you wiped the Republican Party off the face of the earth tomorrow so that nobody even remembered the letter R or the word Republican or even the history of the Republican Party, you would get a new party based in that web-like ideology almost immediately because, as I say, it is now so baked into American DNA the same way the Democrats are. So is there hope for the Republican Party with the name Republican? I'm no longer convinced that it was, although 3 years ago I would have told you it was. But is there hope for that ideology, that traditional Republican ideology? 100%.
Thank you.
Good to
Steve
hear.
Lipsum is now active. Are you there, Steve? Yes. And now unmute. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Professor Richardson, you've spoken a lot about the role of race and economics in leading to the Republicans and getting the foothold they had, and you've not mentioned much religion or culture wars. So are you minimizing the role religion and culture wars played in the development of the Republican Party since World War II, or how would you describe that role?
No, I don't mean to minimize it at all. It's, and that by the way, is a great question too, but simply that we haven't had a ton of time. The role of religion in America has a number of different it has a number of different major touch points. And one of them, of course, is before the Civil War. The religious leaders do, in fact, really reinforce the rise of the oligarchs and begin to preach from the pulpit how, in fact, a few wealthy men should run everything and how everybody else is is in their debt for their paternalism, if you will. But in the 20th century, you have, first of all, the rise coming out of the 1890s of a more traditional fundamentalist tradition. And there are people who write about this much better than I ever will. Darren Graham has a great book called The Business of Christianity, I believe it is. He's a guy at University of Georgia, and the guy who introduced me to the drive-by truckers, by the way. You get fundamentalism rising out of the 1890s, the idea of going back to the fundaments, to the idea of traditional America. And there's a lot going on in the 1890s that reinforced that. We actually almost put an amendment to the Constitution calling America a Christian nation in place in the 1890s. But I think what you're really interested in, and so you get from that this ferment, especially in the South, of traditionalism, and a traditionalism that later is going to lead to the rise of evangelical Christianity. But I think what you're probably asking, which is fascinating, but again, read somebody better than me on that. But I think what you're really asking about is how did it really feed this present moment? And that to me is really interesting, because the rise of the injection of evangelical, especially religion, into American politics is very much a late 20th century thing. Remember, evangelicals had tended not to get involved in politics because they thought it was corrupting. So they didn't very much. But beginning in the midterm election of 1970, Nixon, Pat Buchanan, who's working for Nixon, urges Nixon to try and reach out in that election to the people he calls traditionalist voters. But what he's really focusing on are Catholics, anti-abortion Catholics. And you see in the midterm election of 70, the injection of abortion into American political discussion as at the time, it's not a religious thing yet, although they're attempting to attract the religious Democrats, the Catholic Democrat, the Catholics who tend to vote Democratic. Initially, it's really almost more of a cultural thing, to the point when Phyllis Schlafly first talks about abortion, she does not talk about morality. She talks, or about fetuses, she talks about women's lib, and trying to isolate those women's libbers, as she said, who are trying to destroy the traditionalist family. So you see it enter in 1970 with this outreach to traditional Catholics, and you see the rise of the abortion issue. But you really see this weaponized as a political issue, not just abortion, but religion as a political issue, with the rise of Ronald Reagan. And you see it in his first term, but really dramatically you see it in his attempt to preserve the 1986 tax cuts, which were really iffy at the time. People were not at all convinced he was going to be able to keep those tax cuts because he was afraid they were going to be overturned. And with that, Reagan's people make a real effort to include evangelicals into the political process. And they say straight up that people in power can provide the money, but that it's the evangelicals who can provide the hundreds of thousands, millions of votes that are going to keep Reagan in power. And that really takes off after 1986. And you see it now becoming really a fundamental pillar of the Republican Party because it is now so deeply entrenched in evangelicism. So I think it's really important, and it's important as part of the cultural war. And that really, you see that hammered home again and again and again with the marriage, if you will, of evangelical religion and anti-government activism, especially in the American West, especially in the Plains, through things like Ruby Ridge, through Waco, through that idea of individualism as personified by Christianity and by anti-government activism. And Christianity, of course, evangelical Christianity, really is patterned on the idea that the family, dominated by the head of the household, patterns the U.S. government, but also patterns the will of God, or the structure ordained by God. So if you challenge that in any way by, for example, giving women rights, you're challenging that secularism is actively attacking evangelical Christianity. So I talk actually probably a lot about that in the book in the later section, but I don't know it nearly as well as people like Darren Graham do, like Kevin Cruz, like Randall Stevens, lots of good younger people writing about the role of religion in the modern day political scene. It's a great question.
Heather, thank you. Steve, thank you for the question. I'm afraid our time is about up, and just want to remind people that Heather Richardson's new book is available from Oxford University Press, or your local or not so local independent bookstore. How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. And I'm going to turn this over to Christian Osterman, who will draw this to a close. Christian.
Thanks, Eric. Just to say thank you, Rachel, Heather, that was absolutely brilliant, and I think a really riveting conversation that we've had. We will meet in a webinar next week at 4 p.m. for a panel discussion of Lawrence Luthie's new book, Cold Wars. We hope you can join us. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Heather. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks for having me. It's great, guys.
It was. Thank you.
Thanks.